special meeting of the Board of Education to order at 7:01 on Thursday, January 27th. Kathy, roll call, please.
Yes. Mrs. Acree,
Here.
Dr. Calnan,
Here.
Mrs. Cushman,
Here.
Mr. Hamry,
Here.
Mr. LeBlanc,
Here.
Mrs. Pickett,
Here.
Mr. Ryder,
Here.
Mr. Ungary, and Madam Chair.
Here. Okay, the first item on the agenda is the superintendent's report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to actually do them out of alphabetical order, and you'll thank me later because you won't remember the first two items after I'm done doing the budget presentation. So the first item is the EPS update, and the most important one to give to families that are watching is now that we've had 2 snow days and 1 staffing/COVID cancellation day, that has shifted our last day of school to Tuesday, June 21st. Which, assuming nothing else goes wrong, that still leaves us on Wednesday, the 22nd, for Enfield High graduation, and school would be out ideally before graduation. I should also address, I don't know how much snow we're getting. His birthday will be ruined. I don't have to cancel school, so Mother Nature, I appreciate you. And the only other EPS update at the present time that's changed from the last time we've met is, look, a lot of us are starting to see throughout the state and throughout our region our COVID numbers coming down. And quite frankly, it's the first time in a while that we're starting to see some optimism. And I think today's the first day we've been under 10% as a state in quite some time, which is all very good news. And believe me, there's no one happier than me that this will be in the rearview mirror and we can get our lives back. That said, I don't want to be the downer of the group. I do have to remind people, though, that it is still 10%. And I've been around long enough, and so have most of you, to know that 10% used to be the number that shuts us down. Fortunately, we're not in that position anymore. I'm only saying that because there is still virus around. And our staff is still not immune from it. So I don't want to jinx anything and say we're over a hurdle. We are definitely heading in the right direction. I am more optimistic now that this may be closer to the rear view than it's been, but I still have to remain cautious and for families just to understand that we're still working our way through this. And I hope we don't have to have any more cancellations. I don't envision one. I'm not forecasting one. But I just wouldn't want a family to all of a sudden, or their kid's school gets closed and say, well, how come I thought it was over, why don't you tell us? That said, I'm hoping that's the last time I have to say that. Secondly, and as far as the percentages go, like I said, it's today we're at 10. If we're, we had been in the 20s at one point. So Mrs. Guzzi, if you're watching, I don't know if we're at the 90th day or not, but since we're at 10%, we're using 20, we are halfway there. So you could tell your friends to use that meme. Sorry, that was a private joke. And the last update before I get into the budget is the 2022-23 school calendar. This is a draft. You're not taking any action on it this evening. But the way the process works, I know we have some new members and some members who were on the board last term, but you guys didn't get here in time to have to do the calendar. So I'll just do a quick reminder on how the process works. Per your policy, the board actually sets the school calendar, and you have to take action upon it in February, per your policy. The way the process works, and we thank Kathy for this, Kathy puts the initial draft together based on previous years. At that point, I'm obligated to share that. Not only we look at it here first with my office and Andy and Kathy and Michelle Middleton. Once we think we have a comfortable draft, I have to legally send it to the administrators union and the teachers union for their input. It has been sent to both of them. They do sometimes share suggestions, but they're all in pretty much agreement on the vast majority of the calendar. What was a little bit unique in this calendar that the teachers union obviously brought to my attention, and to be honest, there are things when we put this together on paper, The reason this process is the way it is because it allows, in the event we overlook something or on paper it looks great, then you don't realize, well, wait a minute, this doesn't really make sense. The draft you all received in your packet, I'm going to recommend one change, but I wanted to explain it before you have to take action on it at the next meeting, and we'll provide you with a new one and prior to the February meeting. And if you have anything you'd like to add between now and then, you certainly let the chairwoman know. This is a unique year next year. It's really a unique November. And if you look at the calendar, with regards to conference days, particularly for our K-5 conferences, and just so that people at home know that it's not just the throw the days on the calendar and those are the days we'll use for conferences, there is a little bit more that goes into it because we try not to have all the levels have conference days on the same evenings. So we offer 2 afternoon conferences and 2 evenings. We don't like to do the evenings as the same as, say, JFK and Enfield High, because as a family, if you have more than one child and they're in 2 different levels, at some point you have to pick and choose which kids' conference you're going to go to. So we try to help, not create that confusion for parents. So in theory, you just drop dates in calendars, but that doesn't really work. And traditionally, we try to put the elementary conferences at the beginning of the month. And what we ran into this year is you'll notice that November is a little weird in November of 2022 calendar-wise. So that first week of November, you really only have 4 days to play with because the last day of October is a Monday, and we all know what that is, Mr. Ryder. That's Halloween, or as you refer to as prom night for little kids. So it's hard when he can't respond. So that first. All right, good, thank you. So we're a little bit more limited for days for that first week. We're more limited in days in the second week of November because there was actually only 3 school days during that week, because that Tuesday is election day and there's no school, and that Friday is Veterans Day, so there's no school. So when we originally put this down, we actually spread out the elementary conferences over almost a 3-week period because of where the days fell, without really thinking about how that would affect the teachers in that room meeting one kid's parents one day, and then 3 weeks later meeting another kid in your class's parents. They may be at a different place. In addition, that might have, spreading it out over 3 weeks, especially with evening conferences, it becomes a bit of a burden for staff members too. And I understand that, and that was never anyone's intention. So the request that I'm going to make, and this is just for K-5, is that on Thursday, November 3rd, it's currently written in here, it's an early release day, so it gives us an opportunity to do afternoon conferences and evening conferences that night. We realize that's a lot for one day, but in speaking to folks, they'd rather do it all in one day because we do give them a dinner break. And then that's a Thursday, so they really only have to get through Friday before they get the weekend to recoup from everything. The next one that's on the calendar for them is Thursday the 9th, which is an early release, and there's afternoon conferences. And then you'll see the last one is the evening conferences on the 14th of November. I'm going to recommend changing the 14th to Monday the 7th. We try to avoid Mondays, but given the circumstances, I think that's the best alternative, to make the 7th the second and final evening conference for K-5. And that way they're all pretty much bunched together a little. And the rationale for that is, and again, I don't want to be Mr. Downer, but what we've learned throughout this virus process is I'm hoping that we never deal with this again. But we know that if it is going to happen and there's going to be waves, it's going to happen around the month of November when the temperatures go down and people start going indoors. And the elementary conferences are so important for our families to get an opportunity to meet with their teachers. I'd rather do them at the beginning of the month because as we get closer to Thanksgiving, that's when we start to see the issues this year. So just trying to be a little bit proactive for this year, putting them all together. The other issue that we have when we make these dates is, the dates for Enfield High School are locked in here. And somebody had asked me, well, why do they get the good date? People have to understand there is so much activity at Enfield High School. We have to pick their conference evening days because that's a school-wide activity. And there's so many events happening at Enfield High School that finding the dates on the calendar is that much harder. So that's why we try to, maneuver making sure that we can get the high school dates in for parents to get in the evening, and making sure we find evenings for parents to get over to the elementary school. So the only change I would recommend for what you have is moving the 14th to November 7th as an early release, not early release, I'm sorry, just conferences. And then we have some time to discuss. The state is talking about virtual conferences and things like that. That doesn't need to be decided next week. You just have to do the calendar. But because the conferences are written into the calendar, that would be something you will have to approve at your next meeting. Other than that, if there's questions about that after this meeting, I'm certainly open to answer for you, but I'm hoping that that's the happy medium for this year. And we get this every few years with the calendar, just where dates fall. But really that week of November 7th kind of messed us up because there's only 3 school days. Okay. The last thing on my agenda, and I'm going to ask for patience for a moment because Mr. Barassa has to come back and show me how to actually get the presentation on the screen. I am currently in my office alone with the door shut, as he is down the hall in his office alone with the door shut, but he's going to come back in here and help me with the technical glitch. You won't see me, I think. So the next time you see me is when I'll be done, but I am going to put my mask on for when he comes back in and hope that this goes as smoothly as it did this afternoon. Give me one moment. Okay. Thank you, Guy. Okay, he's gone. I don't think anybody could see me, but
We can
hopefully
see you, Chris.
oh, you can see me. Darn, oh, good. Now I can use my props. Okay. This is a little weird too for folks at home because I'm looking at a different device. But I'll try to look at you while I'm talking. I thought I wasn't going to be seen, so that doesn't work. But this is going to look a little bit different than what the board and the community is traditionally used to when it comes to my budget presentation for the district. Typically, I spend about an hour or so, or a half, sometimes longer, using this opportunity to not only put together a budget request, but really reminding and informing the public, school by school, program by program. It's an opportunity for me to brag a little bit about the great things that our kids and our staff are doing, but it also allows the public an opportunity to see what we're spending their money on. This is a bit of a different year, a unique year in the sense that some of you have asked, rightfully so, and it's been pretty well publicized that we have been in receipt of a lot of federal and state grant funding due to the pandemic. And I believe Mr. LeBlanc and Ms. Pickett, you both asked me, can we kind of get a rundown of where all this money's coming and going from? So that was an opportunity, I think, for me to use that and that the public understand how the grant process works, what we actually received, what we're doing with it, and how that impacts what we ultimately ask the taxpayers of Enfield to fund. Unfortunately, after going through it, that's going to take a while as the traditional going through the motions of bragging about what our kids do. So I made the decision to focus more so on the financial aspects of the proposal with what I hope to be, I think, an agreement with you guys. So you guys have all recently gone through board member training. So you know there are 2 things primarily you're responsible for. One obviously is the budget, the other is policy. But the budget is really the one area that you're responsible for that I refer to as adult only. There's not a lot of kid input into the budget. There could be for policy and things like that, but this is really like your main adult only activity. And to be quite honest, people are probably sick of tuning into board meetings and listening to me talk for a long period of time. So the deal I want to cut with you guys is this is on your agenda for later on this evening to take action on if you choose. You have the opportunity to ask questions. I will share with some of our new members that the previous 2 years, the board did take action on the night that I presented. So it's not uncommon for you to do that. But in the event you were to pass the budget tonight, then rather than me using this time to tell the public and brag about our kids, I would prefer to surrender my time going forward and let them tell you themselves. And I mentioned this last week, and I believe, Madam Chair, you mentioned this as well. We've got a lot of work to do, and who better to tell you about the great things that we're doing in town than our kids themselves? So it's my hope that we can stop the adult stuff for a little while and get back to where our kids are. So assuming how this goes, that's what my intention is going to be. I'm going to ask you all to bear with me as we get through this. You're going to hear a lot about what grants, the grant process for different funding streams are a bit different. But before I get into all that, I think it's important for you guys to all know what our philosophy is when it comes to any funding that we receive, particularly when it comes to COVID relief funds. My number one priority throughout this entire process is getting our kids through a pandemic. That's what the funding is for. That's what our commitment is. And most importantly, that's what our kids need. So from my perspective, any additional resources that we get, they're going to go primarily to making sure we can get our kids through this. You're going to get some presentations in the near future about the state of where our kids are. And I don't like to be the bearer of bad news, but if somebody comes on to TV tomorrow and says, congratulations, COVID's over, we're all going to be thrilled and ecstatic. But the effects that our kids have lived throughout the past 2 years of this pandemic are not going to go away as quickly. And we're going to talk about that a little bit as I go through. My second priority here was trying to stretch this money out as far as we legally can. And I say that because you guys not only employ me as your superintendent to make decisions and give you speeches every couple of weeks, you also pay me for my experience. And if history tells us, we've actually been in this position before. Madam Chair, I don't believe you were on the board at the time, but I remember you being an active parent and ultimately became a board member during this period. But if I can bring everybody back to the last serious financial crisis that we had in this country back in 2008, 2009. Chairman Stokes was our chairman at the time, and the board was in an unenvious position that we didn't have enough money to sustain the staffing levels and the programs that we had. So the board was faced and tasked with having to cut about 20 positions. Now, at the time, there were rumblings that the federal government was going to swoop in and give local boards of education some money to help them get through this tough time. But we didn't have the check in our hand. So we went to a meeting prepared through the non-renewal process to lay off about 20 staff members. And prior to that meeting that evening, with the rumor circulating that help might be on the way, Chairman Stokes made a decision to say, why are we going to lay these people off, cut programs, increase class sizes, only if there's help down the way? Is there a way we can postpone that and hopefully be saved by the last minute by the federal dollars? He took a chance in it and it paid off. So we ended up not laying off those staff members. And you guys may recall the ARA funding that was around 14 years ago now. But that actually saved us at the time. Ms. LeBlanc, you may remember this part. That saved us when we had a budget shortfall to lose, like I told you, it was approximately 20 staff members. But the unfortunate reality is when that funding went away 2 years later, that 20 staff members that we couldn't afford at that time metastasized into 60 staff members. Right. And I say that because I actually was a human resource director at the time. And there might be some people watching this meeting that I had to go to every school in the district and literally lay off 60 people throughout the district and did it with them, privately in an office somewhere. So if history tells us anything, these funds are not guaranteed to be there for the long term. There are term limits to these funds, and I'll explain that as we get through each grant. But that strengthens our philosophy on getting our kids through, stretching this as far as we can so we can sustain what the resources that and the supports we're putting for kids into place for as long as we can, but most importantly, for as long as our kids need them. So you just have to keep that in mind as we go through the process. because as some of the, you'll see the date, the starts and the end dates when we get onto some of the grants. I just would like the board to keep in mind, and this is a philosophy I shared with the previous board when the funding started coming in, about making sure that we did this in a responsible way to last it as long as we can. You're going to see a lot of money up here, and I'll just put it in terms that some people can understand. If I spent it all tomorrow, either everything we got with it has to go, or the town has to pick up the tab. And it would be the last budget request I ever made if I asked the town to replace the amount of money that we're going to try to spend over a long period of time. The first funding that we received was called, under the Coronavirus Relief Fund, it's actually called the Coronavirus Relief Fund. That was the CRF fund. This is a little bit unique than the other funds I'm going to talk to you guys about after. But as you can see, I wanted to put out there for everyone to understand how the process works, with money's classified for, how much we got, and most importantly, where it says date, those are the dates that the grants were awarded and they have to be expended by. Now, in this particular grant is unique to the other ones I'm going to talk about. In this initial phase of the grant, this was actually a reimbursement grant. So what typically the process for this grant is, and you have to look at it similar to how you guys deal with some grants as a Board of Ed, or you will be shortly. These are federal dollars that are then allocated to municipalities and city, local boards of education. The holder of the grant, it goes from the feds to the state. The state essentially holds our money, and then we have to submit applications to the state to make sure that we're using the money for what it was designed for and approved for, and in the appropriate fashion. Once we apply to the state then releases the funds to us. And that'll make a little more sense on the next one, because we actually are a grant holder for someone else in town. What's unique about this first round of funding is the date it was announced was back in March of 2020. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's when we got the money. That's when the federal government finally put the wheels in motion to start putting these grant funding out. This particular fund had to be expended by Halloween of this past year. I already used my Halloween joke, Scott, so I won't do it again. And other grants, the difference will be, and I'll explain as we get into them, the fundings don't necessarily have to be expended by then, but they have to be either earmarked or designated. And there's also something in other grants that's not in this one, which is a revision process that's permitted under the law. So what's unique about this particular grant was this was a reimbursement grant. So people might tune in and say they added $700,000 of salaries. And what I included on all of the grant funds, and what Lorena helped actually included, not me, is when you do the grant application, you list out by object codes. So you'll see 100 is salaries, 200 are benefits, 323 is special ed, 600 is supplies. So when you see that 100 object of $700,000, people think, well, did you add $700,000 worth of people? No, we did not, particularly with this grant. This grant was the one that actually helped us get reimbursed for expenses that we incurred during this time frame. So most of you who were on the board will recall, when the world shut down and we were meeting like this, there were times where I would tell you we had to purchase certain things. At the time, we didn't necessarily have the appropriate funds to pay for them, but we knew that relief funds were coming in and that we would be reimbursed. The best way to explain this to the general public, and for some of our new board members who may not remember how this process works, one of the best things that our previous boards have done, at least over the last 4 years, is you've molded a relationship with the town council that with the 20 of you really act as partners in this process and not adversaries, like has happened in other communities, and it's happened here from time to time. One of the things you can recall from this past, not budget cycle, but this past fiscal year, is every year we have a $72 million budget. There are always going to be money left over. People leave, things don't cost as much as you think, some things cost more. Traditionally, if there were money left over at the end of the year, school boards will spend it. They may pre-buy things, they may add things that they ordinarily didn't think they can afford. we made a different philosophy a number of years ago with the support of the board and also with the support of town council was, look, we may have money left over at the end of the year. That's not a surprise. But can we work together to do big things with that money instead of us just going out and buying as many extra, pens as we can? Just an example. And the decision was if we return the money to the town, and the town would partner with us to do much needed projects in our schools. And the town has honored their commitment. So last year, you can recall that, the Board of Ed actually had $500,000 left at the end of the fiscal year that we returned to the town. The town matched that $500,000 and the much needed improvements at the Enfield High athletic facility, meaning the turf and the track and the scoreboard. Those projects are now funded and will hopefully be underway soon. Because we worked together with the town council. We designated the funds, they matched it. The original number was about 200,000, but because of how we were able to manage the money that we had, we were able to give more than we thought. And before you knew it, there's $1 million project none of us could have afforded, but by working together and being, fiscally constrained, we were able to do it. So when somebody asks, well, where did you get the $500,000? Here's your answer. Because these are all expenses that we paid for ourselves. We prepaid them. And there's an application process to say that any of the expenses we've had during this time frame qualify for reimbursement. And we were allocated $995,000. We applied for, were approved by the state to be reimbursed for those funds. And then we were able to use some of the funds that we received back in reimbursement. We needed about half of it, and the other half was what we were able to help do some much needed capital improvement projects in town. The other piece of what we use, there's a big chunk of that is obviously in supplies. And I'm glad people can see me even though I can't see myself, so it's a little weird. But some of you will remember these guys. When everybody came back to school last year, we gave these out to every kid in town, every staff member in town, and anyone in the community who asked us for. Those aren't free. We had to pay for those. We didn't have a budget line item for masks. If anyone's been to any of our schools in the last year and a half, 2 years, there's a couple of things you'll notice in our buildings that aren't traditionally there. If you go from August to early November, and then again from late March to the end of the school year, every one of our buildings has a tent. And the tent, we don't own tents. We don't have the ability to own tents. But we knew we needed tents in order to reopen our schools safely so that kids can have the opportunity to eat outside, because obviously we can take mask breaks when we're outside and under a tent, and there's still some protection from the elements. We do outdoor classes at our schools. Those aren't free either. We have to pay for that. Again, not line items that we had budgeted for, but decisions that we had to make that we knew would be helpful to keep our schools open and safe. But we were fortunate that we were able to seek reimbursement for expenses like that. I have on my desk here what everyone probably has on their desk. I'm sure we bought this in the past, but I can promise you we didn't buy as much of it as we do now. The thing about hand sanitizer is, and when this is empty, you got to refill them. That hasn't changed, but that's what we were able to use the money for. So when you see supplies, things like PPE, masks, tents, hand sanitizer, if you walk in any building and you see a sign on the floor with an arrow on where the kids can walk to remain socially distanced, we didn't have those. We had to go out and have them made and buy them. So the hand sanitizing stations that you see at all of our schools, all of that stuff that we didn't normally account for, we bought anyway because we had to, but we were fortunate to get some reimbursement back to cover a lot of those expenses for us. So that in turn really bailed us out. That's a unique grant that, again, goes on that reimbursement schedule. The next ones that I'm going to speak of are a little bit different. They're a lot bit different. First of all, I'm going to rewind again. Sorry. No, I won't. The elementary and secondary schools emergency relief funds, excuse me, otherwise known as ESSER. And you probably have heard the term ESSER being thrown out, whether it be in different conversations with the state, the federal government, but the ESSER process, and there's different waves of it. Excuse me. But this is the first wave. This is what we refer to as ESSER 1. So ESSER 1, we received as an LEA, $729,000. Now you can see on that chart, again, here's the object codes that we apply for the grants for. the yellow portion of the chart, we are actually the grantee for the private schools in town. So of the 729, the Enfield Public Schools got 700. The private schools in town got $28,000. We are the steward of those funds for the private schools. So we receive them, we make sure all of the paperwork is in order, but essentially that funding gets passed right to the private schools in town that they're entitled to, but we're the vehicle for that. Obviously, with the last grant, you saw a large number in salaries. This one, you're not going to see a large number in salaries. Now, this is a process where we had to actually apply before we got the money. This is not a reimbursement grant. The purpose of this grant was to enhance and support the things we needed to do to open our schools and keep our schools open. So the first grant, CRF, that was just reimbursement. That money has been expended and is now gone and been received, I'm happy to say. This grant, we actually have to apply prior to, but I want to draw your attention to the dates on this grant as well. And this will be a theme as I go through a few of these. What you'll notice, the last one, the end date was on October 31st, 2021. ESSER 1, the expiration is September 30th, 2022. So going back to our theme of sustainability and trying to stretch this out as long as we can, you'll see we have another year to play with when it comes to this grant. The other benefit of this one is that we don't have to designate all of that. We don't have to spend all of that money by this date. We have to designate it. We have to tell the state this is what we're going to use this money for, even though it may or may not be done by September 30th of 2022. I have to draw your attention on this one to the vast majority of money that we spent and allocated from ESSER 1. And I hate to do this because no one wants to remember this, but I'm going to ask everybody to either close your eyes or do it with your eyes open, but try to remember back to March 2020. In particular, what the world was like when we first shut our doors. And we were told we were going to be gone for 2 weeks. We thought we were as proactive as we possibly could be by sending 2 weeks worth of paper packets out to people. And a lot of you who were board members, Mr. LeBlanc, I thank you again for staying with Andy and I here at central office with Mr. Cruzel till like 11 o'clock that night, passing those things out. But I'm going to jump fast forward over to April of that year. April of 2020, we still didn't know. We were out. At that point in time, we didn't even know if they were going to let us come back at all for that school year. If you recall, the governor was making the decision in 2-week increments. So, mid-April, we weren't 100% certain if we were going to make it back or not. What we also recognized in April of that month, after being out for a few weeks, that this paper packet thing was not sustainable. This was not good for our kids. We couldn't keep up with trying to get paper in people's hands. And to be quite honest, a lot of people didn't want to take the paper from us because at the time they didn't know if the virus was spread based on touching materials. We have since learned that it's through droplets that we all know of. But at the time, people were taking. Some of you may have wiped your groceries down that you no longer have to do. I'm just going back to a really bad time, folks. So there was a lot of uncertainty. Now, when we shut down, the kids who made out best in Enfield were our Enfield High School kids, from a perspective of being prepared to just turn the switch over and learn remotely. Remote learning, social distancing, teams, all of these were foreign things to us at that time. But it was that point where we recognized that our high school kids were able to keep up better because they had devices and they were able to interact with their teachers on a daily basis and actually conduct lessons. But all of our other kids in town weren't able to do that because we simply didn't have devices for them. So it was at that point where Andy and Guy and I started going building to building and closet to closet and trying to get our hands on any device that we had in the district, no matter how old it was, no matter if it worked great or not. And some of you as parents will recall getting a robocall saying, go to your kid's school for a drive-through pickup. And we literally handed families a Ziploc baggie with a device, a cord, and a piece of paper that told you how to turn the thing on. It was at that point that we knew this isn't going away anytime soon. And we better start figuring out a way that, again, we didn't know if we were coming back. We didn't know if we were coming back the following school year. There was a lot of uncertainty at that point in time. But what a lot of people don't know is it was at that point in time where guy was in my ear saying, if this is going to continue, we're going to need to enhance the technology that we offer to our kids. And I just want to pause right there for one quick second on the subject of iPads. I also have to remind some of the board members who were here and some of them who may have been watching at home at the time. We were fortunate for our high school kids that the previous year's budget presentation, like I'm doing tonight, the highlight of that budget presentation was finally getting one-to-one devices in our kids' hands. And there was a debate at that point in time on what type of device we should use. Should we be going for iPads or should we be going for what a lot of other districts were using, were Chromebooks? And I'll admit my initial reaction was, well, we should probably go for Chromebooks because they were cheaper at the time. Two things happened. Apple got competitive and the prices were actually somewhat lesser expensive, and the quality of the device for what our kids were using was superior to what the Chromebooks offered. I say that not as somebody trying to push iPads. I say that as a parent whose kids have a Chromebook and also have an iPad that I bought them. And I can attest, and I will bring them on this call right now to tell them what was better. That was my test case on what actually worked better throughout this process. So I'm pausing and going back to that because I'm going to get back to that point in a second. But as I was saying, Guy had been in my ear quite frequently during this time period of April 2020 when we were literally digging through closets and putting Ziploc baggies together, that if we're going to need devices, we got to act fast because, again, the whole world was shutting down. The supply was going down, the demand was going through the roof, and there was a general concern that these devices won't be there for us if we need them. And I held him off for a little while. I ignored him a couple of times, but he's persistent. And finally, we got to the point where he pulled me aside and said, if you don't act now, I can't promise you I can get them. And I said, Guy, we have one problem. I don't have any money to buy these things. So what are we going to do if I put this order in for 5,000 iPads and I can't pay for it down the road? So this is the one time in my life I recall it was a virtual meeting where I actually came to the board in a setting just like this. And I told the board in public that for the first time in my career, I'm going to have to act like a riverboat gambler. That I'm going to have to roll the dice and hope that if I don't place this order, I'm not going to get them. And I will have to figure out a way to pay for them. Well, every now and then your number comes up. And this is what ESSER 2 comes into it, because this was the money that we used to actually pay for the devices that we ordered before we had the money to pay for them. Before I take credit as a prophet, going back to the device piece, why it was so important that Guy pushed me to do this was our devices came in prior to the summer of that year, which allowed us the opportunity to format them, get them in their cases, and most importantly, get them into every kid's hand who did not have one before they ever returned to school for last school year. The other thing I have to remind you of is during last school year, this device that I'm referring to was the only vehicle for students to get an education for 3 days a week. If you recall, we were in a hybrid for the majority of last school year. And during that hybrid, that meant, depending upon your letter in the alphabet in your cohort, you actually learned in person 2 days a week and remotely 2 other days a week. And everybody worked remotely on Wednesdays. So if we didn't act when we did, and I remind him every now and then, he never rubs it in my face, but I do to myself, that if we didn't act when we did, think of what would have happened if we didn't have devices for every kid in town at the beginning of last school year. For 3 days a week, our kids would have had paper packets at best. I mentioned that story because there's another piece of this that people don't necessarily understand, and it's not anyone's fault. There were other districts that opted to go because this also re-engaged the iPad debate versus Chromebooks. And at that point, I was convinced because my own kids in my house were learning remotely at home. They had a district-issued Chromebook, but yet they were participating in their classes on the iPad that I bought them. And when I would ask them, why aren't you using your Chromebook? Because sometimes some things didn't line up. They would say, what do you want me to do? I don't have a 9, a P, or an L key. It's broken. It doesn't work. So I was pretty much sold at that point that, you know what, we made the right decision with this particular device. The other piece that was a gamble that paid off for us was districts that did go with the Chromebooks And again, it's no one's fault, but I don't think at the time, and you got to remember all the confusion we were all living in, no one realized that the vast majority of the world's Chromebook supply were produced in one place. And that place was Wuhan, China. So a lot of my colleagues were part of frantic calls in September of that year, calling me saying, "Who's your Apple person? My Chromebooks aren't getting here until Thanksgiving." So, they may be in a different position than we were to have other devices to give to kids. But had that been us and our devices didn't come in till November, our kids would have spent 3 days a week with no contact with their teacher at all. So why this is relevant is a reminder of, fortunately, that rumbling of funding might be coming down the pipeline for us to bail us out. It did. And when you see that number of $321,000 on the screen, that's what we used it for. We used it to pay for technology. We used it to pay for not just the iPads, the cases, the support that the iPads require. And you'll see some purchase in professional and technical services in that. You'll also see that we purchased with this funding Wi-Fi hotspots for those in town, for any student who doesn't have high-speed internet in their home. We actually purchased enough of those where we can give them to any child that needed it. And if teachers recognize that kids had bad connections in their house, we would simply just get one to that kid's house without any kind of fanfare, because sometimes kids won't say my internet's not great. So all of that stuff that we were able to do because the funding came through for us in order to make it happen. So I'm not trying to point fingers at any district that went with a Chromebook and suffered for the first 3 months of the year. And this is probably a good time for me to mention, one of the things I usually do in this presentation is do a comparison between, what the state is doing when it comes to funding, what our DIRG is. You guys all remember those charts. There's no charts on that stuff this year. And this might come across rude, but to be quite honest, I don't really care what anyone else is doing right now. Right now, I care about what happens in Enfield. So I'm really focusing tonight's presentation on us. Maybe we'll get to a point we get back to wanting to know how we compare with other people. I know some of you like to see where we stand, with our DIRG and what happens with the state comparison. But for the purposes of tonight, I'm focusing on us. I care about Enfield right now, and that's where I want to make sure we have the funding to sustain what we're doing here. So that's ESSER 1. Now, again, we haven't spent all of it at this point because we still have some time, but that money has been earmarked for the projects that I just listed out. After ESSER 1, there was a second wave of ESSER called ESSER 2. Now, this one's going to be a little more exciting. First, before you look at the giant number, I want you to look at the dates. If you recall, the last date, the end date was September 30th, 2022. As you can see, September 30th, 2023. So now we're getting out an additional year, which gives us more flexibility to sustain the things that we're putting in place with this money. One thing you'll also notice, beyond the giant number of $3.2 million, that's what we have been allocated for the Enfield Public Schools in our ESSER 2 funds. You'll also notice that where it says budget and funds used, I haven't spent it or allocated all of it yet. And that's by design. And the reason for that goes back to what our philosophy is. What do we need to get our kids through this pandemic? And we've already identified the initial needs during the pandemic with PPE supplies and reimbursing the town for funds. The second round of ESSER was really technology focused, and that was the gist of the application process too, making sure that everybody had technology. ESSER 2, the focus shifts a little bit on what necessarily the requirements are, but what we identified as our biggest needs to get our kids through this pandemic. There's a few things in here that you probably heard us talk about or me talk about, but now's a good time for me to get a little bit more in depth as to what we're going to do with these funds. As I said, you can see that we have only allocated about a third of it so far. That's because we're trying to sustain this as long as we can. This is an application process, although it says January 1st of this past year. The application process doesn't necessarily come to us until the spring. We submit it, early spring or late spring, early summer, and then we get notification at some point in the summer whether or not our grant was approved. The other challenging part about this, and look, I've been the first one to, and I will continue to be, that if the state makes a decision that I don't necessarily agree with, I'll be the first one to say it. But at the same time, we all have to be a little better about giving the state credit for the things that they are doing well. The beauty about this is, again, same process, it's federal money, state holds it, we apply to the state approves whether or not what we say we're going to use it for is appropriate, they give us the money for it. When it came to ESSER 2, they put something in there that was very important, was that we have a revision process. So if you can see, that, you know, it's not often I get a check for $3.2 million, but when I get the check for $3.2 million or the notification that it's coming in January of 2021, but I don't have to earmark it or spend it until 2023, you're asking me to forecast what my needs are going to be for 2 years down the road. If we learned anything this past 2 years, we don't know what we need tomorrow. So the state allows us to make revisions to our grant application to meet the needs of what we're facing with on a daily basis. There is some talk that some of these dates are going to be extended again, primarily because of Omicron, because a lot of things people put in place got sidetracked because we were all scrambling to deal with staff shortages and Omicron, and really we had to drop what we're doing to get masks and test kits and stuff like that. That's not official at this point in time, but that has been discussed. But I do want to highlight some of the things that are in here and that are earmarked or already being spent on, particularly when it comes to salaries. I don't need to remind all of you and anyone who's watching at home. Two things that I've said purposely on television over the last 2 years. You know, one obviously was, hey, I'm spending a lot of money that I don't have, but that worked out. And the other was, when our kids come back, we don't know what we're getting. And the reality is, it wasn't until this year that we really saw what our kids were dealing with, because we had them full time again. You know, we did our best last year to get our kids in person as much as we could. A lot of people opted to not come back last year. So this was really the first year was we're in person, we're every day. We thought, all of us collectively as a profession, thought we were prepared for what our kids were going to come back with. But the reality is none of us really knew till they walked through that door. Again, this is a happy time, but I don't need to remind anyone watching at home, because you all have phones, you all have newspapers and televisions. A day doesn't go by where the lead story on the local news station is about an incident in a school, security related, a fight, a weapon, some sort of behavioral issue that escalates into a school closing down. There was a district that had to shut down for a couple of days because security concerns right here in the state. You know, fortunately, we haven't had to do that yet. I don't want to jinx anything. But that's not really a surprise. Our kids have been locked in their houses for 2 years. They were going to come back different than when they left. So we tried to be as proactive as possible to put the mechanism in place to address the needs that the kids had when they came back here. But we really didn't know till they walked through the door. And this is part of the reason why every chance I get, I thank our staff members, because in addition to what we're all dealing with in our own worlds, they're dealing with kids like they've never seen before. And it's not their kids' fault. Our kids need help. And the purpose of this money is to give these kids help. So we now, and I'll go in a second, there's some positions I do want to highlight. And I appreciate Madam Chairwoman and Ms. Pickett mentioning at the last board meeting of a new position that we have here in the district called our Director of Educational Equity. Ms. Cox Blackwell actually started Monday, which we're very excited about. And I apologize to her and everyone else, although I put out the press release, I didn't give her a proper formal welcome on camera yet, for two reasons. One being, she's only been here about 48 hours. I wanted to give her the opportunity to figure out, to not take a left down Enfield High when she's coming down Route 5, figure out where her office was. She didn't have a phone. So I didn't want to say, oh, by the way, you've been here for 12 hours. I'm going to bring you to a board meeting next week. So you will hear a lot about the work that Altressa is doing for us and the importance of it. And we'll certainly address that as we go down. But I will do a better job of introducing her to the community than I've done thus far. And that was one reason. And the other reason I mentioned earlier, the application process. So when we submitted the grant, I had built this into the grant, the funding to fund that position and the supports needed to do this work. I got a call, and this wasn't public knowledge until now, which is the other reason why I wanted to be able to say this before I introduced her, was when we submitted the application, a few weeks later, I got a call from the commissioner's office. And the commissioner's office asked me about this position that we had written into the grant. And I'll be honest, my first reaction was, uh-oh, I think I did something wrong. That's not going to make it. But I was pleasantly surprised at the response that I got from the commissioner's office was, this is exactly what the state wanted us to use this funding for, where otherwise we may not have been able to afford venturing into this work. The state was hoping that districts would utilize this funding opportunity to support positions like this in their districts, and they made a request of me. And they asked if I'd be willing to sit on a panel with the commissioner to talk to other superintendents and other boards of ed about the ideas that we had put into our grant application and what we're hoping to implement here in town, with the hopes of giving other districts the opportunity to see sort of how we're doing it and doing it right, and what the state and what the federal government is envisioning to use with these funds, and to kind of go on the road, talk about and get us an opportunity to brag a little bit. And I said no to the panel for two reasons. One is Altressa wasn't here yet, and I didn't think it would be fair for me to go around and sit on a panel and talk about someone when no one, we hadn't even posted the job yet. And the other piece was because the grant hadn't been approved yet. So I wasn't comfortable talking about this great idea we had to use this funding for and how the state's supporting it when the state hadn't really supported it yet. So the response about the second question was kind of a chuckle of, well, I guess you could probably figure out where we're going with your grant application. So I actually found out on the phone we got approved prior to the formal documentation that it was approved. But I think it's important for the public to know and for the board to know that the state is really supporting this work. And, their words, not mine, we're really modeling for what other districts can do, not only with the funding, but with the work. And we're really pioneering not this idea of having an educational equity director in your town, but utilizing the resources to really enhance the work. And what really was most, I think, impressive to them was how we centered all of this work on what was most important, and that was our kids. And I mentioned that to some of you in conversations I had. There's a reason that our title might be a little bit different than what you see in other communities. It was imperative for not only me, but for Altressa, that education was included in the title, because that's where our focus on this work has to be, and that's where it will always remain. That's one position that's included so far in what we've budgeted. There's another position, another several, and I'm going to jump to the next slide. And again, there are still PPE supplies. Like I said earlier, like this stuff runs out, we got to replace it. When we run out of masks, we switched over this year from the green ones because they get gross to the disposables. That stuff's not free. I know it's still on everybody's mind because we just did a mask distribution at the state level, and we're grateful for that. And the state gave, testing kits for staff members, and we're able to give them to kids. But you have to go back to a time, and I'm talking about PPE supplies, where you couldn't get a mask. I think all of us remember. I don't know if anybody remembers going to a grocery store early on in this, and at least my wife sent me out with like a bandana with a couple of my kids' hair ties on my ears because I had to go to Stop and Shop, but nobody wanted to leave the house, and you wore rubber gloves if you had them. We were in the same boat. We didn't have supplies. We had to buy all that stuff, and that's going to continue. We're still going to need to continue to buy these types of supplies, but now we have the resources to do it. I'm going to jump ahead to the bullet points because I want to elaborate more on the positions that we have. As you can see, we now have a social worker in every one of our buildings. Now, we've had school social workers here in the past, but we never had the luxury of having one in every school. We've had one that worked in every school, but a lot of them, they were split, particularly at the elementary level. See, we may have had one social worker split between two buildings, some case 3 buildings, some moonlighting at the high school, at the middle school. This funding allowed us the opportunity to hire enough social workers so that we have at least one dedicated social worker in every one of our school buildings. Again, this is one of the things we try to be proactive with, understanding that the social and emotional needs of our kids were going to be at the forefront of their return, to have resources in place. We also have a social worker at our alternative ed center, which is something we've never had in the past, but this funding allowed us to do that. Behavioral technicians, some of you who've paid attention to the work of the board over the last couple of years will remember, I don't remember the years, when we first introduced the concept of Eagle Academy. One of the more interesting aspects of the design of Eagle Academy was a new position there that we had created and hired and trained for, called behavioral technicians. And this is by no means a knock on a paraprofessional, but traditionally in a classroom, there's your teacher and there's your paraprofessional. If our student has an emotional outburst of some kind that ultimately, turns into something physical, the only line of defense in those classrooms is the teacher and the paraprofessional, which results in teachers and paras getting kicked and bit and spit on and all that stuff. We knew with higher level behavioral needs, particularly at Eagle Academy, that we had to hire someone who had that expectation that that was part of their job, that may happen to de-escalate a physical altercation with a kid, but also that we had a responsibility to train them properly and to reclassify that role with the expectation of, you are the de-escalator when it comes to a behavioral outburst in a class. So all of our behavioral techs are PMT trained. They follow the same process everyone else does if there's ever an incident to restrain. But there's an expectation with that position that people sign up and they know what they're signing up for. Whereas in the past, our paras didn't sign up to get kicked or bit. Whereas now, it doesn't make it any better, but at least our behavioral technicians knew what they were signing up for, and most importantly, were properly trained on how to handle it. It's a safety issue, not just for staff members getting bit and kicked and hit. It's a safety issue for other students, most importantly, because if a kid is having an outburst in some way, in all likelihood, there's a potential that they can hurt another child. They can also hurt a staff member, or they can hurt a bus driver. We started off with about 9 at Eagle Academy, which was about where we thought we would be. We now have over 40 in the district. We have a behavioral tech in every one of our buildings. I can't see anyone now, but I know Andy's on the call. A day does not go by where Andy doesn't get a call from a principal asking for more behavioral techs. They've been a godsend during this process because our kids are coming in with a lot more behavioral issues than when they left back in 2020. But we're in a position to not only add these folks, but also, based on the previous slide, how I didn't spend everything yet, to sustain this for as long as we need. And that's the point. I did not buy anything that I don't believe we can keep for the long haul. Summer school, for the first time and that I can remember, any student pre-K through 12 that was interested in attending summer school this past summer had the opportunity to do so. Traditionally, only our students with an IEP, some years past JFK, and at Enfield High School do credit recovery. Those were the summer school options. This past school year was the first time we've ever offered summer school to anybody who wanted it, pre-K through 12. We never did it before because we couldn't afford it. But now that we've got this ESSER II funding, that was one of the priorities that we built into the grant because we wanted to offer summer school. Kids had been not in school on a regular basis for a year and a half at that point. But again, to be proactive, if kids attended summer school, we would see them and we'd have an understanding on where our kids were before they came back in September, so we can add more supports and know what to expect when they came back full time. But we had one of the best summer school experiences we've ever had in the district, but that's thanks in part to the funding that we had through ESSER II. You're going to hear about ELL students later on, but I do have to take an opportunity now that the number, to inform the board, and I've said this every year I've done this, the number of students that we have in district where English is their second language has increased dramatically over the last 4 or 5 years, which means there are increased needs that we have to give resources for these kids coming into the district. We were able last year, I mentioned this during the last budget presentation, that our ELL program were great people. They were retired teachers and they were part-time tutors. So imagine for a moment you have a student who comes straight here from another country, doesn't speak English. They would get about an hour or so a week with a tutor to help them become proficient in English. We recognized a number of years ago at the urging of Dr. Burr that these are really needs of certified full-time staff members. And we now actually have a department called TESOL, which oversees all of our ESL components of all the program that we do in throughout the district. But those needs are still increasing. Now, fortunately, so we've had to actually add during this school year an additional TESOL teacher to meet the needs of the kids that we had coming in. The benefit of that was we had the funding that we were able to designate throughout ESSER 2. I believe, I know a lot of you have asked me this question over the years. I just distinctly remember a genuine concern from Mr. LeBlanc about chronic absenteeism and making sure that we make connections with kids that maybe got a little disconnected throughout the pandemic. We were able to put components in place, in the needs of staffing because, everybody already had a full-time job, but trying to track down kids that maybe we weren't connecting with throughout this whole process. Making sure that we were putting programs in place to cut down absenteeism. Because if we learned anything, the more we have them in school, the better it is for everybody. We were able to use the funding to put programs and people in place to help address our chronic absentee issues that we were having pre-pandemic, but get expedited even more so once people left. And then again, obviously the PPE stuff hasn't gone away. So that's what we've designated thus far, with the hope of sustaining through the ESSER 2 grant. And now for the granddaddy of them all, the American Rescue Plan. A lot of you heard about this. I'm going to warn everybody when I hit the next button. Let me explain before you get excited. Yes, we were allocated $7.2 million. Other thing I want to draw your attention to is the dates. There's a theme here. The last one was 2023. This one gets kicked out to 2024. It's an application process like the previous two grants that I explained. This has not been spent yet. When we put the application in, we have to designate what the money's going to be for. The only money that's been allocated of this $7.2 million thus far has been the project at Stowe to expand, to actually reopen the play lab, which the board is aware of. And I'm happy to say that the electricians were over there today digging trenches so that we can get our temporary space over there. And those of you who don't know, have any idea what I'm talking about, throughout the pandemic, one of the greatest things we have at the Stowe Early Learning Center is the play lab. And it's not just for our kids or our eaglets. The FRC uses it. The whole community used the play lab. And that's where John Daig built all this amazing stuff for kids to play with in the sand and all that stuff. Well, because of COVID, obviously that had to close. Now, because of spacing issues, we've had to reutilize that space between the partnership we have with us and the town, with ECDC being there, that we haven't been able to reopen the play lab. Throughout this process, we were looking at different ways that we can create more space over at Stowe. And one of the ways where we can't add on to the building at the point in time, but one thing we could do was bring in some space in the form of, before you freak out, trailers. It is not going to look like JFK. These things look nicer than the office I'm in right now. But one of the things we are able to do with this funding is allocate about $500,000 to purchase 2 trailers to go outside of Stowe that will have electricity in the whole 9 yards. They won't have bathrooms. But in those trailers, they're not going to be classrooms of Stowe moving outside. That'll give us an opportunity to reopen the play lab sort of independently from the building, but to continual use and get the community and our kids back in the play lab again. That project has been stalled once or twice because of issues beyond our control, but I was told that Eversource was over there as early as Tuesday of this week, starting to put power from the street to where the pad's going to go to where our trailers are going to come from. So that still leaves about $6.8 million that I haven't spent yet. And there's a couple reasons for this. I don't know if they watch meetings online, but if this was on TV, I'd have to give a shout out to my old friends, Bob and Jack, who every year used to come and remind me about, what we needed to pay for, and always came from a good place. But I always would ask a question about grants, so before anybody gets too excited, I cannot take this $7.2 million and cut our budget by $7.2 million. The short answer is it's illegal. These grants cannot supplement. They could supplement boards. They can't board budgets. They can't supplant them, which means it has to go in addition to what you currently have. Let's say for a moment I said, you know what? I got $7 million. I don't know what to do with it. Let's just cut the budget by $7 million and replace it with this. The first thing that would happen was the state would call me and shut us down. And if anybody wants a reminder of that, go back to the time when we consolidated our buildings and grounds and custodial services and transferred that over to the town of Enfield, and they took over that responsibility from the board. We also sent the funding for custodial and buildings and grounds over to the town, and it's now in their budget. About a week after we had done that, I personally got a call from the state that said, it's illegal, you can't cut your budget by that much money. I then took the next probably 2 months trying to explain and show the receipts on what we actually did and why it was legal to do so. So that's reason number one why you can't do it. The other reason is, realistically, if I were to do that, what do I do next year? Because I know for sure that if we spend this today and next year that money is gone, that I would have to go back to the town and ask them for at least $7.2 million, which is a 10% increase before I ask for any other increases. And that would probably be the last budget that I ever presented to you and to the town. So just to put that to bed, I can't take that grant money and use it to supplement the board's budget. We have to only do that in addition to. That said, there are some pretty interesting things that we are able to do with the American Rescue Fund Plan money. One of the areas that you are able to use this funding for are for large capital improvement projects. Now, I've heard from some of you in the audience, I don't think I've heard from any board members, and it's rightfully so. It's definitely a legitimate question when it comes to upgrading our, HVAC systems in all of our buildings. This is the money that I have for it. And if we were to decide to utilize the funding to upgrade ventilation systems in our buildings, I would have to ask the board, which two do you want me to do? Because that's about how much money we have to do projects like that. Unfortunately, our buildings are old, as some of you are learning on joint facilities. And in order to do a project like that, not only is it costly, because then you get into issues of abatement and things along those lines, there would also be a process we have to follow for that. We can't just go do a giant project in a school building without going through a referendum process, without going through a building committee for something like that, just like you guys are going through with roofs. It is more complex than that. And the reality is we don't have enough money to do all of our schools. So I don't want to be the one to pick which two and leave the other 6 behind. So, fortunately, Enfield High and JFK won't need them, but that leaves everybody else. And I don't think that's a decision that the board wants to make either, because we can't do for all. But what we can do is we are not the only ones who received money under the American Rescue Plan. The town of Enfield also received money under the American Rescue Plan. Now, what people may not know is since we were notified that this funding was coming, I have been in discussions with our friends at the town, the previous manager, and fortunately our new manager, Zappo, who I didn't formally welcome to our last meeting either, so I apologize for that, to say, look, this is a once in a lifetime grant. It's very rare that we're ever going to get a check this size from the feds that says these are the rules you can spend it on and have it be a little bit ambiguous. So we recognize that this is going to be kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. And are we better off putting our heads together to come up with a project that will benefit the schools and the entire community as a whole? Because once this money's gone, there's one thing I know, it's gone. So we've been having conversations about projects that might be under consideration in the event that we're able to get it through the rules process. I'm going to frustrate you because I'm not going to tell you the ideas, and there's a couple of reasons for that. The main reason is the rules for the municipal side of the ARP money just came out last week, and they don't go into effect until April. So in conversations that Ellen and I have had, we said we are both definitely on the same page that this is a once in a lifetime, legacy project is the way we kind of catalog them, is we have a chance to do some really cool stuff here with physical plant that we ordinarily don't have the money to do. But we have to make sure that it fits. It's got to pass two tests, the lawyers and the finance directors. I'm not doing anything if it's illegal. I've said this last week or last board meeting in a different context, but I'm still not going to jail for any of you guys. And the finance directors are not going to jail for me. So we have to make sure we pass those sniff tests, and any great idea that we might have, we have to make sure that the bean counters and the lawyers say, nope, you're allowed to do it this way. My commitment to you as a board, and it's really a commitment to the 20 of you, meaning the board and town council, is once we know what we're capable of doing with this, our plan all along was to bring it to you. So that way the board and the council would have input as to what's happening with, with any of these potential projects. We envision that process being open as well. So people in the community saying, well, what are you going to do with all this money? Once we have a better idea, we'll tell you, and we'll give you an opportunity to say whether it's something that you agree with or not. What I'm not going to do this evening is tell you some of the ideas that I don't know if they're even legal, and have people either really excited because it's pretty cool, some of the stuff we have, or have people really mad only to tell you in April, yeah, that doesn't count anyway. So we need some time and a little bit of patience to get our ducks in order. But I don't want anyone to walk away from this evening and say that, Ellen and I are just going to start, getting cranes and stuff and building stuff and not tell you guys. You have to be involved in the process. I'm just not ready to do that for you guys now. The other piece of all of this is don't get fixated on the 7.2 because 500,000 is gone. Going back to my original philosophy and belief system on this, I am going to need some of this money to sustain the things that we've already put in place. 10 social workers, I'd like to keep forever. We can use some of these funds to sustain that. It's all within the rules. The behavioral tax, the supports we have for kids, the equity, all this stuff can be sustained. So at the end of the day, it's not going to be a $7 million contribution on our part. We are going to need some of that funds. But that said, we still should have a large chunk of this money available, as well as a commitment from the town that we'll split it like we've done before. I mentioned the field project earlier. That was, hey, you gave us 500,000, we'll put 500,000 and we'll start fixing stuff. So that's how a lot of these projects have gotten off the ground. So in a nutshell, the American Rescue Plan, again, this is going to help us sustain what we currently have, the things I've told you about earlier. A little bit unique where we can do some large capital projects with this funding, but we can't do it alone. We have to do this with our partnership with the town. And the town manager and I are on the same page as far as putting our heads together and our resources together for betterment of the entire community. We just need a little time on that. You're going to get your play lab back, assuming the trailer shows up. But that said, the whole point of utilizing some of these funds was things that we lost due to COVID that we need to get back. And the play lab was it was heartbreaking to have to shut that down. And now we have an opportunity to put that back up. So just to recap, again, this is about $12 million. $12 million that we need to use to get our kids through this pandemic, that we need to stretch out as far as we can so we can create sustainability in this district. If I were to spend all of that $12 million by the end of this year, that's $12 million that you need to ask the town for next year, but it's actually not $12 million. I go back to my earlier story about when we cut 20 positions, saved them, and then ended up cutting 60. That 12 million is probably going to be closer to 18 to 20 a year from now. Why? Because everything goes up. Things cost more, especially when you're trying to sustain them. So we have a responsibility, and the last board was aware of this as we started getting these grants. At least I'm in the minutes telling you, we're going to try to manage this as responsible as we can to get the most benefit out of these fundings for as long as we can. At the end of the day, with one thing in mind, doing the best we can to get our kids through this difficult time. Okay. Promise the rest will be quick. Our current budget is $72,109,522. That's it. Has nothing to do with the last hour I've just talked about. That was an hour presentation that was long due about all of the grant funding because it's been well publicized. That has nothing to do with what I'm sharing with you now. The $72 million, that's what the town of Enfield gives the Enfield Board of Education for their adopted budget. Fixed costs. 1.77% going into next fiscal year is what we need in addition to what we currently have above that $7.2 million or the $72 million to just continue operating with everything we currently have today. That's the cost of doing business. I'm going to use a word, it's not popular right now, but I think it's important. We all know what inflation is now, unfortunately, because if any of you bought a gallon of milk today as compared to a year and a half ago, you know what it costs. Inflation is up 7%. For some reason, our inflation is really up 1.77% because we try to manage your money like it's our own. So there are places that are going to ask for large increases because everything has gone up. I keep bringing the hand sanitizer and keep bringing supplies. Everything's going up. Supply chain's down. Shipping costs are going up. We're not immune to it because we're a public school system. Doesn't mean, well, inflation doesn't count to you. It only counts on milk and gas. No, we still use milk and gas. Everything goes up. We're not immune from inflation. But compared to what inflation is at 7%, 1.77%, we're actually not doing so bad. I know it's more than what some people would like, but again, this is what it is. The only request that I'm making, in addition to what I need to keep everything we have in this year's budget, is to add a new team to JFK Middle School. Some of you may be wondering, I usually see him wearing an E or an Eagle or an Enfield Public Schools thing. Well, I'm glad you can't see me. It was 2 props I had tonight. You can probably see the Patriot on my chest. It's JFK week or year. You all are aware that come September, you're all going to be invited to a ribbon cutting ceremony over at the brand new JFK Middle School, of which I'm proud to say that we will have the nicest middle school in the state of Connecticut. I'm extremely confident in that. But I have to remind the board, and some of you who've been on the board for a number of years, this ask isn't going to be foreign to you. We are currently operating down a team at JFK, and there was a few reasons we were able to sustain that. The biggest being construction. We didn't have anywhere to put the team. So it was sort of a perfect storm a number of years ago. We're going on about 3 now, where we were able to reduce a team because the enrollment was down, but we didn't put it back because we really didn't have the place to put it back. So I know I've said this every year when we go through the budget and I talk about all the great schools individually. I always mention JFK. Don't forget, I got to put the team to JFK back. Well, this is the year, or else we open a brand new middle school with class sizes bigger than what they are now. Our kids and our staff at JFK, you want to talk about troopers? Not only did they live through COVID and everything else that we've all lived through, they have done so in temporary spaces and being shifted from one room to a next, almost at a moment's notice. The building's going to be ready. We have an obligation to put the team back. Now, what a team at JFK means, for those of you who might be new to this, every team at JFK, so if you're in 7th grade Blue House or Red or whatever, I know they changed names now, I can't keep track of all that. But the essential team has 4 core teachers to it: English, math, science, and social studies. Every team also has a special education teacher. So there are 5 FTEs or new teachers that I would have to add to bring the team back. Now, I'm really just replacing what we took away a number of years ago, but it's time I have to put it back in. That also is equitable with every other team in the building. So this new team isn't going to get something new and fresh. You're just going to get what every other team would be. In order to add the team back, I also have to add a specialist. Now, that could be in the form of art, music, PE, or tech ed, technology. I don't know at the moment what that specialist is going to be. And I say that because the schedule for JFK hasn't been done yet. First of all, the schedule can't get done because Ms. Horan does the schedule, and she has to schedule the building based upon how many teams she has to fit kids into. Once she does that process, Ms. Horan and Dr. Wiley, who handles a specialist schedule for the district, will get together and figure out where pieces fit among what kids are requesting to take. So how many art teachers do we need, how many music teachers, how many tech ed teachers? If I had to take an educated guess, that specialist will end up becoming a tech ed teacher, because if you haven't, the hub at JFK, which used to be, the auditorium, has now been transitioned or pretty close to transitioned to the best middle school technology education center I've ever seen in my life. So my gut is telling me there will be a need and a want by students to get more involved in technology classes. So that might necessitate us adding a specialist in technology, but I can't commit to that at the moment because we haven't done the scheduling yet. She can't start the scheduling until she knows how many teams. So the sooner we do this, the sooner she gets scheduled, the sooner we know what kids will be offered next year. The last bullet point on this slide is an ask, though. Although it is going to be housed at JFK, it's not a combination. It's not inclusive of that team. And that's a bilingual teacher. So I mentioned earlier about the needs of our ESL students throughout the pandemic and being able to put resources in place for that. And this is where our friends who don't like mandates that I mentioned last time, I don't like mandates either. I think we're on the same page on this stuff. But this is a result of a state mandate. And again, I'm not saying I don't endorse it. I don't believe it. I don't like being told we have to do something. I'd rather do it myself. That said, the number of ESL students that we have designated in a building, once you hit a certain threshold, you by law have to offer a bilingual program. So sort of think of it sort of the traditional co-teaching model, where you may have an English teacher and a special ed teacher co-teaching a class. Well, in that same vein would be a bilingual teacher based on the school that reaches the threshold of how many students qualify for English language learning services. At the moment, it appears as if JFK would be the school, but I have to warn you that Enfield High School is also getting close. We won't know until later on in the conclusion of this school year as to whether or not the position definitely needs to be at JFK or at the high school. But Dr. Burr has assured me, by adding one FTE, that we will meet the mandate doing that. I say that mandate portion of it because this JFK team adds an additional 0.53% to the budget request that I'm asking for. If the board doesn't have the tolerance for adding this new team to JFK financially, understandable. That bilingual teacher staying, whatever iteration of this budget ultimately becomes adopted, that bilingual teacher will be in there. And that's kind of what I was getting to with the mandate piece. Whether we get a 0, a 10, a 2, a 4, we're including a bilingual teacher next year because we have to by law, which means we would have to cut something else in order to fund it. So I have included the bilingual teacher in that 0.53 increase for the JFK team. I have to remind everybody about the minimum budget requirement. I spoke earlier about the relationship that the board of ed and the town council have had over the last couple of years, where we were very open and transparent with each other. This is what our needs are. We're not asking for things that we don't need. And we also understand that we might be able to afford it as a community, but let's talk about it. Let's talk it through. One of the practices that we've had over the last several years, and you'll hear this MBR conversation if things get heated, is by law, again, it's a mandate, that the town council has to appropriate a certain amount of money to a board of education every year, whether they like it or not. So if, let's say it's 72 million, that increase is based on whatever our ECS calculation may be. So when the state does the education cost sharing grant, if that grant were for Enfield to go up by a certain dollar amount, there would be an expectation by the state to the town that the town would increase the school board's budget by at least that amount, whatever the increase is, not the entire amount. So for instance, in the last 2 years, our ECS allocation increased about 5.8%, which is about roughly around $400,000. So at a minimum, the town had to allocate at least $400,000 more each year to us as opposed to the previous year. That was what's mandated by law with the minimum budget requirement. I've included the 0.59% of what the minimum budget requirement is expected to be this year in the numbers that I've shared with you already. And I've done that after consultation with the town manager. In years past, and I'll get to that last. The board has requested a 0% increase, and the town knew that eventually they would have to give us a little bit more of that money. This was never a fight. I don't want to give anybody the impression that it was, well, you got to give this to. It wasn't that. This was all work, open and transparent and honest. And the town's position was, we'll give you anything that you're entitled to. We'll give you more if we can, and you'll see soon later that they did. And I appreciate the commitment and the respect that the council did by in backing up their words. But through this process, what we've practiced the last couple of years, where the town wouldn't allocate that funding in our initial allocation in May when they adopted the town budget, but they did so with an agreement that as soon as the state gives us the check, we'll just turn it over to you. Now, what that resulted in is after the budget was set and adopted, the council would have to do a separate appropriation of that dollar amount back to the Board of Ed. And what I've learned is it actually causes more work on the town side because we just accept the money, but they have to go through the they have to go through the appropriation process again. In talking to the town manager, we're going to take a different approach to just that number again, to just include it because that's money you're getting anyway. So just include that now. Let's not worry about giving it back to you in the summertime because legally it's coming anyway. Let's save ourselves a step. I don't know what that number is going to be. State hasn't allocated that yet. So that MBR requirement of 0.59% is just based off of what we've gotten the last couple of years. Obviously, things are going to change between now and May. But in the current year, that's what we're at. So that 1.77% in fixed cost I showed you earlier, I factored in that 0.59% to cover the fixed costs. So this is what I'm asking for, 2.31%. I told you what your MBR is going to be, that 0.59. It's essentially, if you want to look at it one way, it's 1.72% more than what you're going to get. You're going to get that 0.59 whether you ask for it or not. What you're asking for at the moment is an additional 1.72%. Or if you want to take the chance and not put the team back in at JFK, you're really asking for an additional 1.19%. But the overall number is 2.31. I don't like this process because there's so many things we don't know yet. We don't know people are going to retire. The challenge that we have is they don't have to legally tell us until mid-February when your budget's already sitting on the town manager's desk. So what we do know at the time is that 2.3 or that 1.77 of fixed costs, that's going to change. What we do in my proposal is I give you the worst case scenario. We know our insurance numbers are not going to exceed what I have in the budget, but we're a self-insured plan, which means we pay for claims as the claims come in. Now, our insurance carrier tells us this is what we think your increase for next year is going to be, but they give us a not to exceed number. So if they give us a number, they say this is what it's going to be at most, knowing that it should go down because claims traditionally go down in the spring. Our trend history and all this insurance stuff will tell you that it should go down from there, but you don't know. I anticipate the insurance figure going down. I'm just not comfortable taking it down any further than where I am now because that's me predicting what's going to happen between January 28th and June 30th. So I anticipate there will be some savings there. And the last piece is not just retirements, but everyone who works here now is probably not going to be here next year, not because of something we did, but because they're looking for a change. And that's the unfortunate reality that we all live in right now. So I mentioned earlier when it came to the grants that our kids were hurting. I have to recognize that so are our staff members. For the first time ever, I'm hearing from people that they're not eligible to retire, but they're looking to do something else. You know, if we're all being honest with yourselves, anyone who works here, that's who I'm talking to now. I'm not going to lie to you and say I haven't thought to myself, is there anything else I have transferable skills for? Because this is getting to be a much. Now, I'm not planning on going anywhere. I'm not saying I'm looking to leave, but I'm just saying our staff members are struggling right now. People are going to leave. If they don't want to do this anymore, they're smart people. They will find something else to do. What that means for us is we're going to still be kind of chasing the dog a little bit, trying to replace them. But I also know that we're going to probably have some financial flexibility when we do have a turnover in personnel. I wish the last one wasn't true. I wish I didn't save money in our budget request because people are leaving. But I also live in reality. It's going to happen. I also wanted to mention this tonight, although it's not necessarily part of the budget, but it is something that the chairwoman brought up last week was, or 2 weeks ago, and I kind of alluded to it in the beginning of this is the last adult thing to do. I can give you an idea if you guys are looking for a project that fits into what your responsibility as board members are. This profession is in crisis right now. And I'm not trying to preach to you. Talk to a teacher. Talk to an administrator. Talk to a para. Talk to a cafeteria worker. This education as a profession, and we are not alone, is in one of the worst crossroads that we've ever been in professionally. You guys have an opportunity to address that. As a Board of Education, you were supposed to advocate for public education. Public education is this profession. You have resources at your disposal with organizations like CABE, with advocacies, with talking to our legislative leaders at the town, state, and federal level. I have had this conversation with high-ranking members of Congress as well as high-ranking members of the federal government, I will say, that we can see this train coming. We need to address this now because what's going to happen if people start getting out of this profession, which they are doing at a rapid pace, who loses in the end? It's not something that we can just, we'll just find somebody else to take their job. If our best people go and we have to replace them, we're not replacing them with our best people. And that's not a knock on who we hire next. But ultimately, who's not going to get what they deserve? It's going to be our kids because we can't put our best resource is a good person, a good teacher, a good administrator, a good para, a good clerical staff member. That's the best thing I can spend your money on. This is something that you can do as a Board of Ed to start addressing this crisis publicly, because I've had the conversation with lawmakers higher than your pay grade, and it's not a surprise. And I wanted to take the opportunity while I had everyone's attention to bring this issue to light, because if we don't start being proactive in this, our kids are going to lose out in the long run. Okay, back to the budget. What do you get? 2.31, you get no reductions in staff or programs. You get a new team at JFK. You get your bilingual teacher. You get to keep everything we currently have, in addition to what I shared earlier on the grants. Let's put it in perspective. Here's the one chart I saved from the last couple of budget processes I've done. Now, this wasn't always all me, but I went back to 2014. So the top yellow chunks, you can see that's what the superintendent's proposed budget request has been back to 2014. And you can see we're usually in that same area. The next green area is what you as a Board of Ed have actually approved and sent over to the town council. And the last pink area is what you actually received from the town council in an appropriation. I do got to bring some attention to some numbers here. I don't want anyone who hasn't been paying attention in the last couple of years to think, well, you didn't get anything or didn't ask for anything. The last few zeros, you actually voluntarily requested them at my request. And so I don't want anyone to think, I mean, people will look at the bottom number and people in my position, this is where your hair gets lit on fire. Like, you've only given us 1% over the last 3 years. No, that's true. That's what we've gotten. But we did this in conjunction with the council. We made an agreement to get to this because let's face it, none of us knew what we were facing, particularly throughout the pandemic. So people might say, well, the board didn't ask for anything and you didn't get anything. No, you all did this voluntarily. I want people at home to understand that. This isn't a knock on anybody. This is not pointing fingers. This is what we put our heads together to try to get the entire town through the tough time that we're getting through. I know some colleagues of mine are going to say I'm crazy because, you never got anything, you should ask for more. Well, like I told you earlier, I don't care about anybody else. I care about us. So, Madam Chair, I don't know how long I was, but I told you this would be long. Why I did the other things first. It is on your agenda later this evening for you to take action, if any, and at that point, it would probably be appropriate for me to, any questions that you may have of me, I'll be more than happy to answer, but I am going to turn the mic back over to you and hopefully turn mine off. Actually, I take that back. I'm going to ask Guy to come back down here because I don't know how to see you. All I'm seeing
Okay.
is a blank screen right now.
All right, thank you. Okay, item 4, unfinished business. Item A, policy, Board of Ed policy revisions, the second reading. Mr. Ryder?
Yes, so I just wanted to acknowledge that I appreciate the fact that at the last meeting, the first reading passed unanimously, 800. The only reason it wasn't 900 is because I was stuck on a flight. I was supposed to be on the ground in Atlanta and visiting you virtually. But due to the weather that day, as you recall, 2 weeks ago from Tuesday, not 2 weeks ago from this evening, it was 2 degrees here in Hartford. And for some reason, my plane left a few hours early, so I was not able to join you virtually. Otherwise, it would have been 900. So again, the policy revision, second reading, first reading passed unanimously, 800. So I move forward with pushing forward for the second reading at this point.
So do we make a motion to do
Could
that
I-
or?
Could I just say something?
Tina, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, Madam
I
Chair.
think,
you're
no,
muted.
I apologize, just for parliamentary. I think we have to make a motion to approve it, have a first and a second, and then we can discuss it.
Sure. All right.
Correct.
So I
It's-
make a motion to approve the second reading as the first reading has passed unanimously. Thank you.
Okay.
Second.
Second.
Okay, motion by Mr. Hamry, second by Mrs. Pickett, and now we're opening up for discussion. And Ms. Cushman, you have your hand
Thank you.
on your little, okay.
Yeah. I just know from the assignments that were brought forward last fall, that were brought to our attention by some of our community members. And it was communicated to the board that the board was responsible for these assignments, that they were the direct result of our policies. So I find myself now being part of the policy committee, looking very critically at every aspect of the policies, recognizing that what ends up with our students is the result of our policies. So I just want to be looking carefully for the safety and well-beings of our kids, of what's ending up in the classrooms. So I know at the last meeting, I had concerns about the principles and practices of the SEL not being defined, and that really, I haven't seen anything about them being more defined. I expressed some concerns about CASEL and the comments that were made by their president and CEO. And then recently we got on Tuesday some emails from our community members that had some suggestions for edits specifically to policy 0200 and 4131. And there was a lot to them. It was quite lengthy, their suggestions. And I think just we ought to take those suggestions seriously. And I would just like to suggest taking those two policies in particular back to the subcommittee and having an opportunity to discuss them there.
Well, as the policy committee chair, it did pass through subcommittee and it did pass unanimously, 800 through our first reading. So again, I moved to vote. I called the question and moved to vote on the policies that we discussed.
Second that.
Well, excuse me, I do remember saying at both the policy committee meeting and at last meeting for first reading that I was only going along with the assumption that these principles and practices would be defined, and they haven't really been defined. So
Yeah,
I feel like our community members submitted some suggestions for edits that I think it would be a welcome thing for us to take them seriously.
That's fair. I still called the question. I say we move to vote because again, the first reading passed unanimously as it already passed through the subcommittee. So Madam Chair, I default to you.
Mr. LeBlanc and Ms. Pickett had their hands up prior to the question being called. So I'm
Thank you.
going to start with Mr. LeBlanc.
Fair.
So I understand that there's been concerns over, some of the assignments and, things that have been, viewed, from our community. With that being said, the current policies being discussed tonight, I think are as straightforward as they get. And I think self-explanatory to a degree. When it comes to social emotional learning, I had to do some research on that myself. But based on my experience over the last 2 years, being involved with the Enfield Public Schools through the Board of Education and seeing how our schools integrate that, to me, it's really nothing more than teaching students self-responsibility, social skills, and decision-making. And I know that's extremely important, not only for our high school and middle school, but especially at the younger level, where I think SEL is perhaps integrated more than anywhere else in our school system. So to me, the policies as they stood have my favor.
Okay, Ms. Pickett.
All right. I just want to be a little bit more clear about the emails that Ms. Cushman is suggesting and the policy changes that she is referencing that we received that I'm not sure if the public is aware. We did receive some emails regarding some revisions that some community members had sent our way. And I just want to be pretty clear that this work, has been happening in our district for a while. SEL is not new work. I'm sure many of us remember things like character education or responsive classroom or things like that, that is, work that's been broadly supported across aisles in education for a very long time. There's also federal and state law that outlines this work. It has standards and it's research-based, so all of this is public information. But most importantly, it assists our staff and our students with life skills, and I think that's really the important piece. The other thing that I just want to say clearly is that the suggestions that came, at least to my email address that Ms. Cushman is referencing, were inappropriate and harmful to members in our community, especially our community members who identify on the gender continuum or people of color. I want them and everybody to know that I affirm who you are. I won't stand for some political stunt. In fact, we should be advocating for these folks, not judging them, not making assumptions or false characterizations of who they are. So this wasn't addressed appropriately in subcommittee. What I think was being proposed in those emails is actually radical political ideology, and I suggest that we move to vote.
Ms. Acree had her hand up prior to that, so I'm going to allow Ms. Acree to speak.
Yes, I think that the policies, I agree with Ms. Cushman that they should be tabled, that we should look into them further, only because the parents are outraged about a few of the lessons that have been presented to us, especially this pizza lesson. So I feel that we should look into it more instead of just voting first. But, we do have some parents that are concerned about certain things, and no, we cannot use the language that the parents presented on our email, but I still think that it should be looked into further.
Okay, so Mr. Hamre, Ms. Cushman had her hand up, and Mr. Ryder. So Ms. Cushman, I'll go back to you. I'll go back to Mr. Hamre, and I'll end with Mr. Ryder, if that's okay.
What I don't want to communicate is that I'm not against any SEL. I think that what's been defined in another policy about SEL is just exactly in line with what we would hope. But I feel as though there's a lot happening in our nation that if we look around and think that if the same materials are being used in other places, the same professional development materials, how can we end up with different results? I just think we need to be more careful about defining the SEL and other things so that we are making sure that it's fair for everyone. So making a motion to take them back to the committee is what I would encourage.
Mr. Hamry?
Thank you. So I want to address a couple of things. We did talk about this in the policy committee, and we've gone into these policies pretty clearly, pretty thoroughly. I want to just take a quick sidestep to the comment that Ms. Acree had mentioned about the pizza thing. I've heard about this earlier this evening, and I want to be very clear about this. It is not something that is originating in our schools, this pizza thing. If anybody with a computer right-clicks on the image, does a Google image search of that image, as I did earlier this evening, it took me less than 1 minute to find the source of that pizza thing. That pizza thing is from a study done at Cal Poly Humboldt. I've got it on my computer screen here, where it is a study on, let me just get the information correct. I don't want to misspeak. It's a study done through a program for sexual violence bystander intervention programs. That graphic that people keep referring to about this pizza thing is taken from that website. And it's under the section that they talk about consent and communication activities. So before we go running through the streets with pitchforks and torches, let's do the due diligence and find the sources that are generating this information. This information is not something that was brought up through a frontline teacher in our schools. It originated somewhere else, through a national source, no doubt, that had a ulterior motive to cause dissension among the rank and file teachers, perhaps, maybe, but definitely the parents. So I want to be very clear about that. Consider your sources when you're talking about these policy changes. Consider your sources when you're thinking that maybe we should take action because this thing is very upsetting. And yes, if that thing was being taught at our schools, I would be just as upset as any responsible parent would be. But in the case of this issue, this is not something being taught in our schools, just like all the other things that are supposed to be all fired up about and is not occurring. Okay? So to that point, no, I don't have any interest in bringing any of these policies that we've already approved in the subcommittee and approved in the first reading unanimously. I don't have no interest in doing any of that. I would like to see this motion pass, and I would appreciate that opportunity to vote on it. Thank you.
Mr. Ryder?
No, I'm good. Again, just to reiterate, this passed unanimously, 800, and it only would have been 900 had my travel arrangements not gone awry. So I just called a vote.
Second.
Kathy, roll call, please.
Give me 1 second. Mrs. Acree,
No.
Dr. Calnan,
Yes.
Mrs. Cushman,
No.
Mr. Hamry,
Emphatically, yes.
Mr. LeBlanc,
Yes.
Mrs. Pickett,
Yes.
Mr. Ryder,
Yes.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
motion passes.
Thank you.
The next item on the agenda is item B, BOE policy adoptions, the second reading. Mr. Ryder?
Same as the last batch, passed unanimously. These were just some changes based on the legislative changes from the June of the previous year. So again, they passed through subcommittee. They passed unanimously at the first reading 2 weeks ago Tuesday, to be clear. So again, I move that we vote once again to pass the policy adoptions for item 4B.
Do
Seconded.
I have a motion?
Second.
Motion. Who was the
Second.
first?
Motion.
Motion by Mr. Hamry, seconded by Ms. Pickett. Are there any discussions?
I have just one question, and actually it might be more for Chris, and it doesn't have to be answered here, but this policy chunk had some some revisions regarding attendance and process there. And I'm just wondering how our district takes into account our discipline and the impact that that has on attendance as far as that policy. And that can be a discussion off table. The policy itself is fine, but I am interested in the impact of discipline.
Yeah, it might be more fruitful to have a conversation in another format than this.
That's fine.
Any other discussion? Kathy, roll call.
Mrs. Acree,
Yes?
Can I just clarify something with Mrs. Acree? Your hand is still raised. Did you have a question, Ms. Acree, or?
No,
you-
I don't
Oh.
know how to get
I
rid of
think
it.
if, oh, that's okay.
Thank you. I was going to say, Mr. Cree, if you could just click it again, it goes down. And I was going to say to the chairperson, if she could ask you that, because I did see your hand was up.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, I just didn't want to miss you. Okay.
Dr.
Okay, I'm sorry,
Kalman?
Kathy, go ahead.
It's up again.
Dr. Kalman,
There you go, it's up. Oh,
Yes.
Mrs. Cushman,
Yes.
Mr. Hamry,
Yes.
Mr. LeBlanc,
Yes.
Mrs. Pickett,
Yes.
Mr. Ryder,
Yes, thank you.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
motion passes.
Okay, the next item under new business, A, discussion and action regarding the fiscal year 2022-23 budget. Does anybody, okay, we have some hands raised. Okay, Mr. Ryder?
Thank you,
Oh,
Madam
actually, I
Chair.
have to put it to motion first, right?
Sorry. Yep.
Motion to approve the
So
fiscal
moved.
year 2022-2023 budget as presented by Mr. Drezek tonight for the
So moved.
2.31 increase. Moved by Mr. Hamry. Do I have a
Second.
second? Second by Mr. Ryder. Any discussions? We're going to start with Mr. Ryder.
So first of all, I wanted to thank Superintendent Drezek and Assistant Superintendent Longi for their presentation. I know that that's a team effort. That is not one person doing this work. It's not even two people doing this work. It's countless folks at central office, and it's all our administrators, and it's the leaders in each of our buildings. And I appreciate everything that they did and everything they put forward to get these numbers to us, and to also understand that while presenting their numbers and their lists of wish lists and wants and needs, because they had 3 categories or more to put each thing in, is this my wish list? Is this my want? And is this my need? And I believe that Superintendent Drezek has given us the needs every year. He and I started around the same time, and at least as in his role as superintendent. And I feel like he's always given us what his needs are. He's rarely given us his wants. And he never gives us his wish list, because we all know that if any one of us had an unlimited budget in our house, that our kitchen renovation wouldn't be $10,000, it would be $50,000. And our new roofs would last 50 years and not have a 20-year guarantee. So I want to acknowledge the work that goes into this, because this isn't just Chris presenting this for 83 minutes, 83. This is the work of over 1,000 staff members in our buildings. And I appreciate the work that they did and the input that our administrators, our principals, and our vice principals went to all of our teachers to solicit. I think the number is fair. Obviously, we're going to have questions. There's going to be things to comb over. I think that we can't just say, oh, the government gave us X amount of millions of dollars and there's your Band-Aid. That is not the case. That is not what that money is for, as Superintendent Drezek has explained to us again this evening and over again during this pandemic. And he has my support. He has my family's trust. And I believe that it is a modest request. And I hope to work together with the 8 of you, as well as with our partners at the town council, and that we're able to leave that number, because he doesn't give us a number to say, I want 9 and I'm okay with 6. So if you give me 5, I'll figure it out. And I just wanted to put that on record. So thank you again to all of our administrators. to our assistant superintendent, and most of all to our superintendent of Enfield Public Schools.
Ms. Pickett?
All right, so budget's not my thing. My husband upstairs handles all of that, but I tried to put together some budgety questions while you were presenting, Mr. Drezek. First, I'm excited about this idea of legacy projects and partnering with our town. I know it's historical, but I think this really is an innovative time, and we have an ability now to do things differently, to rebuild with all in mind. And I'm excited to see that I'm actually most happy to see that we're being intentional and taking our time and considering how to spend that money. I know that we will be involved in some of those discussions, but a couple of things that I just want to put out there because it's important to me and to what I've heard from families and staff that I've been chatting with. One is around academic needs, accelerating learning. Not sure if we're considering summer programming for this summer kind of universally, but there is definitely academic needs that are still happening with students. The other is around supports for staff and students. You mentioned kind of behavior techs and discussing the desire and need for those. I'm wondering, what our efforts look like in prevention, and how are we understanding how we're building a system of support. Universal preschool. Stowe is an amazing place. So I think, if every student in Enfield had an opportunity to go to that building, that would be such a win. We're already ahead of the game in the state. So I do want to give kudos to Chris and to Stowe already that what we do with preschool in town is already amazing. So here are my budgety questions that I would like some type of answer to. One, you had mentioned designating funds and that we don't have to know when they're going to be used by. Is there an end date, or is there an indefinitely we could designate funds to?
Sorry. Yes, I thought the first parts were your question, so I started getting answers to those. So first thing I failed to mention, and thank you, Mr. Ryder, and thank you for reminding me, was 83 minutes. Because it was 83 minutes, I did leave a few things out. Mr. Ryder is 100% correct that this is not just me. I'm the one who has to sit up here for 80, and I apologize. I see you here, my camera's here, so I'm gonna look like I'm not watching you. Yes, the process does start where it goes all the way down to our staff members. They make requests to their administrators, they come up through us. I want to let our staff members know, just because I only asked for one thing in particular doesn't mean we're not going to try to get them what they asked for. Or more importantly, if they ask for things that they need, there's a lot of time between now and when this gets passed for us to get creative in ways to get them. I never want to have a faculty member say, I really wish I could have done this, but I just couldn't find the money. So we have a track record now of doing that. The other thing I forgot to mention was you all now have received, because Guy just sent it out, the actual presentation as well as the budget book. Those have also been posted on our website, both the presentation and the book that includes this number. So I apologize, I meant to tell you, oh, by the way, you do have the book so you could see what if you're potentially voting on. You had mentioned summer school. I told you about what we did last year for summer school. I'm stopping a little short to say we're doing the same thing again, but I can sit here today and tell you that I absolutely would love to do that again. Tying that into academic progression, I think we have to kind of look at the evolution of what our kids are coming out of in that stage, like dealing with the immediate need of dealing with the crisis and then regrouping. So a lot of our folks that have come on board or have been on board realize that the needs are going to change, their reaction is going to change, their needs in regards to professional development is going to change and has changed already. But also what we look like today is not going to be what we look like a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, with the hope of dealing with the immediate needs. Because anything, and Mr. LeBlanc, you had mentioned this when it comes to social emotional learning, our kids can't learn at their potential if they're still dealing with mental health issues. So we need to address the mental health issues. And listen, I've sat through every one of our meetings the last 2 years. It's been traumatic for all of us. Imagine what this meant for a 7-year-old or a 13-year-old or a 15-year-old at the time who's now graduating from high school, having lived through all this. I say this because I've seen it in my own home. So yes, we can't we can do two things at once. We can walk and chew gum. We can still try to maintain and make academic progress, but we're not going to make as much academic progress until we address the immediate concerns of what these kids are coming out of. And then the other piece I mentioned that we have social workers. Part of that was a discussion with our colleagues at the town, and our social service director was, this is something that's always bugged me. You know, they have social workers, we have social workers. Well, we have the kids for 6.5 hours a day. You know, the other 13.5 hours a day, they're home. And that's when their staff members interact with them. We need to bridge that gap. And by having more resources in our hands to do that, that's actually on the table. And I mentioned you're going to start hearing more about where our kids are as far as, you know, student surveys and things that come out that we partner with the town. But we've already been having those discussions for the better part of a year of, they're still our kids. Like, we just have them, it's like custody. Like, we got them for a certain part and you got them the other part, but they're still the same kids. And you shouldn't be doing something differently that we're doing. We should be doing this together. So that's what I thought your questions were. I apologize. I forgot the actual question.
Sorry, no, it's okay, Chris. I was
End
just
date,
giving you,
I got it.
I was giving you my wish list.
Yes, end date. So we have to designate by that end date on what we intend to use the funds for. There are timelines that the funds have to be used by. I'm hesitant to say that out loud because we're already hearing that they're going to change even more because of what we're dealing with. So even though it's said on there 2024, we're still thinking 2 years out from that we should be okay with. So like 2026 is the numbers that we're hearing. So there is some time, which is why we're not rushing to, well, hurry up and spend this because we're going to lose it. And I've had this question, and I'll be honest, I've had this same conversation with our Congress people at the federal level. And our Congressman Courtney's always been nice to us. He's been wonderful to us. He's been great to me. And I expressed the concerns to him, and he said, we understand that. And trust, you know, we'll work together. And there hasn't been a time that if he has a question from the floor of the House of Representatives where he would call me and say, can I say this out loud? So those conversations are open. Those communication lines are open. So we're not alone in this either. Everybody's facing the same issue. So I think there should be a little bit more easiness to, or everybody take a breath. Like it's not like a use it or lose it type of thing. I couldn't figure out the way to say it. Sorry. I think that was the question.
You're good, Chris. Thank you.
Mr. LeBlanc?
Thanks for the presentation, Mr. Superintendent. You did bring up something in the presentation that I was actually going to ask you about in this meeting. So it works out kind of well. Because I was reading over the Stowe Early Learning Center weekly newsletter, and Jacqueline Valley highlighted that Stowe aims for an 85% attendance rate. That's kind of their benchmark goal, and they're actually doing extremely well at 88%. So that got me thinking, and as you stated in your presentation, that this has been on my mind before about attendance and students who are absent or even more so chronically absent. So I went into the Connecticut.gov ed site, and I went back and looked at some of our numbers from the last 3 years. I noticed in 2019 to 20, we were at a 94% attendance rate. Then move forward, 2020, 2021, we were at 96% attendance rate. And that actually ranked 39th out of 203 school districts in the state. This current year, we're at 92% attendance rate, and that ranks 135 out of 203. Now, I don't want that to seem like it's a dramatic drop, because I don't think it is. Anything above 90%, I think you're doing a phenomenal job with attendance. 9 out of 10 kids, those numbers are phenomenal. But it's encouraging that you have mentioned that it's a top priority to address, and I hope that through that we can get back up to that 2020, 2021, or even back 2019-20 and get it up another couple percentage points back to where we can, be in that top 100 in the state again. So, I don't know if you have any more comments to add to that, but I'm glad that it was addressed tonight in the presentation.
I just would add, and I agree, and I wanted to make sure that I made a point to say that in the 83 minutes I had. There are a lot of things that we've been doing to address that, because if our kids aren't here, they not only can they not learn, but we don't have an eye on them. We can't support them and find out whatever needs that they have. We're also getting creative. I mentioned that we have a social worker now at our alternative ed program. That's one of the programs I want to bring in front of you guys, because those are the kids you're talking about that are on the brink of either not coming to school or, God forbid, heading down that path of possibly dropping out, that because we have that resource for them, that sometimes the traditional school day doesn't work for every kid. There may be things in their life that they can't control. Maybe they have to get a job to support their family, so school's not a priority. Our program over there does an amazing job of targeting those kids that need something non-traditional to make sure we get them through. And now that we really only have 6 months of anecdotal data to look at, but that also coupled with everybody coming back to the door at once. So now that hopefully we are starting to get back to normal a little bit, that's an area that I want to expand upon. There are creative ways, and you probably shouldn't ask me this because I already talked for 83 minutes. There are ways that we can address those kids who don't necessarily can't use the traditional schedule for whatever reason because of things they don't control in their own lives. There are options for those kids if we provide them. And one of the great things about our program is it not only proof that it's working for us, and it's no secret that those numbers increased when that program became in existence. So I want to give credit to Marilyn and her team over there, Mr. Malley, because they have done a tremendous job. And you don't have to take my word for it. We actually tuition kids into that from other districts surrounding us that don't have the resources to have a program like that. So that's not just one area. The folks, particularly at Enfield High School, need as much credit that Mrs. Clark, Mr. Clark, Ms. Gagnon, all the deans, about really making connections with kids to get them back into school. So it is a concerted effort. It's one of those areas where we now have resources to support that more, but now it's an opportunity for us to expand on it. And that's something else you're going to hear about in the coming weeks. So I appreciate that, bringing that up again.
Is there anyone else who has any questions? I just have a couple of things I wanted to mention. First is the sustainability that we've always talked about. I know that you had mentioned previously when we started getting funds in that it was of utmost importance to make sure whatever changes we were going to make were going to be sustainable. So I'm happy to see that that is a forefront on these thoughts and with these additions that we're going to be making. I'm also very interested to see or hear, I should say, about how those funds aren't allowed to be supplanted. Because in the past, when we received funds, that's exactly what happened. I think it was in the amount of like $2 million during the time when our budget was getting cut that the money was supplanted, meaning we got $2 million stimulus in, and that meant the state could reduce our funding by the $2 million. So we weren't getting 4, we were still getting 2, we were just getting it in a different way. So I'm very happy that was also thought of ahead of time. And I agree, the buildings and grounds, there's been a lot of concerns, during COVID that have been brought to us. So I look forward to working with the town council on this, with those funds and moving forward. So I appreciate your budget update. Usually I am the last one to go, but again, I'll open it up if anybody else has any questions or concerns or. Okay, somebody, Amanda.
You made me think of one. Chris, you had the JFK team in our operating budget, not in the grants budget. Is that going to be a yearly need to expand a team?
No, expand, once it's there, we'll have to sustain it, but that's not COVID related. So we couldn't make that connection to put that into the grants. That has to go in our operating budget, but that would be, to be honest, that's where we took it from originally. But that
But
would
if
be
we
in your
open
budget going forward.
if we open a sixth, like if we create a sixth grade team, next year it'll need to be a seventh grade team. So like, will we need to add more teams?
No, what happens is that your class sizes obviously will be smaller, which is ironic because our class sizes are highest they've ever been at the worst possible time, being crammed into a temporary space. So I have to thank the team at JFK again, because nobody really understands what life has been like for those folks. But no, traditionally when we have our set number of teams, and based on what we know our enrollment projections are coming up from 5th grade and 4th grade to previous year. Now there may be years where there's 10 6th grade teams and 9 7th grade teams, where the following year might be, and it's the same thing with elementary school classrooms. There might be 15 sections of kindergarten don't get excited, Jim. 6 sections of kindergarten at Barnard this year and only 5 first grades. So next year we have to make six sections of first grade, but then we know with our incoming kindergartners, we can go back to 5. There's always a juggle year to year. And you can ask some of our least experienced teachers who get asked to move from grade level to grade level every year because of enrollment. That would be the same thing that would happen at JFK.
Perfect. So thank you for explaining why that's in the operating. What about the supports for our multilingual learners? So that EL teacher, is that something that we could think more intentionally about and be innovative with our ARP funds as far as building multilingual learner supports?
We were able to do some with ESSER because there was a connection to the pandemic that the needs increased because, let's face it, when we were shut down, if there were kids that English was their second language and they were stuck at home and maybe didn't have access to talking to, interacting with their teachers every day, those needs were increased. The bilingual teaching position does not fit in that category. So that has to be built into our operating budget.
Thanks.
That was the other thing I had wanted to mention about the team at JFK. I'm happy to see that addition. I know we've been talking for years about how that was going to be needed based on enrollment numbers and different things like that. So I'm happy to be seeing that on this year's budget. Josh is having an issue connecting again, and he had a question. So if you don't mind, we'll just give him 1 minute to connect. Something happened with his network.
Oh,
You need to go run him a hotspot, Chris.
Yeah, I know. I could throw one from here. Well, not anymore.
Madam Chair, Amanda has her hand up.
But there's somebody waiting to get in the lobby.
Oh, it's
Yeah, that was
Josh.
me. This is Joshua Hamry.
CR.
Is now
Yeah,
joining.
I just let him in. I just let Josh.
Yep,
in.
thank you.
Josh, you had a question regarding the budget or comment?
It's more, yeah, comment more than a question. And I do want to thank again Superintendent Drezig and his team that have put together the budget. And I want to express my gratitude to the entire EPS staff from the top to bottom for the efforts that they're putting in during the unheard of last 2 years. I would offer that in my very limited experience with this budget process, that this request is a modest one, given everything that is going on, everything that has been thrown at the EPS staff. And I want to express my admiration for their diligence and perseverance through this process, through this pandemic, rather, excuse me. I would, in my view, the request is a modest one. And the one thing that stood out the most, aside from the impacts that we don't see in terms of the social and emotional impacts to the children, is the where was it going with this? I apologize. I got thrown off when I lost my network. The thing that I want to highlight is the retention impact. We are in a position where retention is going to be a challenge for any employer, as we've been hearing about. And in what profession is it more important to retain the people that have been doing their best to keep our children grounded and who are there to watch them through their education process and through their day-to-day. It's that retention piece that stood out just after the social and emotional impact of this pandemic and the education experience that our students are receiving. So without further delay, I do appreciate the opportunity to speak through the phone line, if not through the actual online meeting. But I thank you very much for the time, and I appreciate the work that they've been doing. Thank you.
Roll call, Kathy?
Oh, yes. Mrs. Acree,
Yes.
Dr. Calnan,
Yes.
Mrs. Cushman,
Yes.
Mr. Hamry,
Yes.
Mr. LeBlanc,
Yes.
Mrs. Pickett,
Yes.
Mr. Ryder,
With gratitude, yes.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
motion passes.
Okay, new business still. Item B, February 22nd, 2022, regular Board of Ed meeting. Mr. Dresik?
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. So due to the holiday of President's Day, your regularly scheduled meeting for February 22nd has to be essentially been canceled. The town council has not canceled. Town council is scheduled to meet on that Monday, but that's a holiday, so they automatically bump to Tuesday, which means that bumps you out of your time slot. So you don't have the ability to meet on that Tuesday, which doesn't fall within your regularly scheduled meeting dates. So as a board, you have the option of canceling or postponing that meeting, moving it to a format like this.
Joshua Hamry?
Is now
Um,
exiting.
I'm not 100% certain. I just want to warn you because when two town meetings are going simultaneously, only one can be live at the right time. So if you wanted to move that meeting to a virtual format, then you would have to probably be taped and then ultimately put on YouTube. And I would defer to Alex after the meeting to find out the specifics of it. But the short answer is the council's in the chambers that night, so you're getting booted.
So I guess the suggestion would be to cancel the regularly scheduled meeting, and if there was a need to meet, it would be a special meeting that we could schedule.
That's
Should
what
there
you've done.
be,
Yeah, traditionally what the board has done when you don't have the chambers available because of the television connection and the ability for the public to tune in, the board has typically canceled the regular meeting, and if a need arises to have a special meeting, you can certainly post that as long as it's within 24 hours, similar to what you did this evening. Yes.
okay, so do I have a motion to cancel the February 22nd, 2022 regular Board of Ed meeting?
Motion?
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Ryder, seconded by Mr. Hamry. Any discussion? Kathy, roll call?
Mrs. Acree,
Yes.
Dr. Calnan,
Yes.
Mrs. Cushman,
Yes.
Mr. Hamry,
Yes.
Mr. LeBlanc,
Yes.
Mrs. Pickett,
Yes.
Mr. Ryder,
Yes.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
motion passes.
Okay, the next item, item 6, board committee reports. We're going to start with curriculum.
All right. So we met last week, and I'm going to address what that meeting was about. The agenda item actually came because of the social media TikTok challenge. And if you all recall, we got a school messenger about it on December 17th. And there was lots of concerns around digital citizenship, internet safety, media literacy. So we had Dr. Wiley come and present to us where she discussed the guidelines and recommendations with those 3 bodies of work. And what's happening now is Enfield Public Schools is taking inventory of the efforts district-wide, pre-K through 12th grade, identifying gaps and ensuring places where all students, not just a course or a few students, but all students have access to this material pre-K through 12th grade. So there are some gaps or some areas where we're going to have to get creative, especially at the secondary level. So that is an area that's going to be addressed. They are also working intentionally and meaningfully at how we're going to integrate those topics with our academic content areas, vertically aligning the work, and ensuring that families and parents have this information, especially since what's going on with social media and the use of internet is such an important and ever-changing topic. We will be also discussing TAG at some upcoming meetings. But since that pizza assignment and some assignments were mentioned, I do want to say that I, as the curriculum chair, met with Michelle Middleton to discuss the emails and concerns that we got and to get some clarity around where are they coming from and how is that being addressed at Enfield Public Schools. So Chris Drezik, if I say anything wrong or inappropriate, you can feel free to correct me. But what I learned in this conversation with Michelle is that assignment came from a health class. And I want to be clear that this classes come from state legislation and families have the choice whether they want their child to participate or not. So there is family choice in those courses. Every family beginning in 4th grade gets a permission slip home to them with the units and topics outlined along with Enfield Public staff contact information for their families if they have additional questions. This is guided by the Healthy and Balanced Living Curriculum Framework. So if folks are interested to know what those standards are and what we're learning at each grade band, that is where you can find that information. Health begins in 4th grade. However, it is not delivered in 4th grade. It's done as a take-home activity. So it officially begins 5th through 11th grade. Again, it's a parent permission. There are information sent as far as the units that are covered with an opportunity to discuss with staff. As far as the assignment that has been circulating, the second page was posted by mistake. It was not presented that way to students. It has been rectified and addressed. And the first page topic, consent, is something that is aligned to the Healthy and Balanced Living Curriculum Framework for that grade band. So I just wanted to clarify that. And that's the end of my committee report.
Okay, finance, the budget committee.
There's no report for finance and budget.
Thank you. Policy committee, Mr. Ryder.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So we met on January 18th. And for those who aren't on the email blasts, I'm just going to review the minutes quickly. So the committee members continued reviewing some CABE policies. 6172.6, 6146.11, 5131.911. Those policies were tabled in order to wait for input from our staff, those who actually work with our students, and so they could comment and let us know what they would want to see changed or, corrected as submitted to us. Committee members approved the following policies for first reading, which we'll be doing soon: 5141, 6142.102, 9350, and 5112. Again, these were just recent changes made in legislation last June down in Hartford, and we're just going through those. It's kind of like the second half of the packet that we were given from Mr. Longi. And then from our December meeting, we continued discussion regarding a few policies that were brought to our attention. And those policies were all passed as legal, compliant, appropriate, and appreciated. And those were policies 9325.2, 9130, 5145.35, and 0523. And our next meeting will take place on February 15th.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I also have the leadership committee. The leadership committee met on Tuesday before our board meeting. We spoke about bringing the student representatives back from Enfield High to participate in our board meeting. So Mr. Drezik and Mr. Longi are going to look into that. And then we also spoke about the policy regarding audiences. I had missed that part of it during the policy meeting the week before. So we spoke a little bit about that. And that was what we discussed in leadership. The next committee is joint facilities. Mr. Ryder, do you want to update on joint facilities?
Joint facilities has not met. Oh, I'm sorry. They did meet on the Thursday that I was away. And our next meeting is coming soon. I don't have the date in front of me.
Okay. And the next item is the JFK Building Committee.
The JFK Building Committee has not met since the last time we were together as a group. And I will get the date for us or any recaps going forward.
Joint Security Committee.
Joint Security meeting has not met this quarter. We should be meeting soon, and I will announce the date once I have that. I believe right now it's scheduled for March.
Okay, Joint Insurance Committee, we are meeting in March for that, and me and Mrs. Acree will be on that committee. The Youth and Mental Health and Wellness Advisory Committee. So both Dr. Jerry and Jean have reached out to me regarding this committee. Dr. Jerry has gone so far as to look into the resolution, and they've both expressed concern how the committee used to meet quarterly and that they think they should be meeting more often, especially with the discussions around youth mental health and the pandemic. We're going to, I think, as a team, Jerry, Jean, and I reach to, oh, hold on. Can you guys hear me still?
Yes.
Okay. My AirPods died. We're going to reach out. I think the three of us should reach out to the town manager and the town council leadership and figure out where this committee lies at this point in time and to see how we can get that up and running, because I think it's important. And I know it's important to both of you because you both mentioned it to me separately. Scott?
No, Madam Chair, I just wanted to compliment you on that because I was copied on some of those emails where you were asked by Dr. Callan and Ms. Acree about that committee. So thank you for looking into that. Thank you for reaching out to our town council counterparts. It is a very important committee, and I hope that it doesn't fall by the wayside. And I do want everybody to know that Tina has been looking into this, and it should continue and it will continue. Thank you.
Mr. LeBlanc?
Yeah, I'd also like to highlight that, to second what Scott said, but also to highlight the co-chairs on that committee. That'd be Representative Arnone and Tim Neville, who head that up. So they'd be great points of contact, and it's a committee that is certainly of need. So, thank you.
Okay. I don't think there's any additional committees. Moving on to item 7, approval of minutes, special Board of Ed meeting minutes, January 11th, 2022. Do I have a motion to accept?
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Hamry, seconded by Mrs. Pickett. All in favor? For show of hands on this.
Madam Chair, I was not available to attend the special meeting, so I can't confirm the minutes. So for this specifically, I will abstain.
Okay. So there is, can I see a show of hands again so we can let Kathy know? So there's 7 for Dr. Calnan. Are you in support of the minutes?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So 7 for and 1 abstention. Thank you. The next item, regular Board of Ed meeting minutes, January 11th, 2022. Do I have a motion to accept those minutes?
Moved.
Motion by Ms. Pickett, second by Mr. Hamry. Show of hands.
Madam Chair, as parliamentarian, I can confirm that I watched the video of the meeting and the minutes reflect what occurred in them. So I can actually vote on this matter. So I do approve of those minutes.
Okay. So I think that is 8-4. Dr. Calnan, can you
Yes,
just...
I approve.
Thank you. Next, we have the regular Board of Ed meeting minutes, January 25th, 2022. Do I have a motion to approve?
Yes,
So moved.
I approve.
Motion by Mr. Ryder,
I
seconded by Mr. Hamry. A show of hands.
I second the approval as well.
Thank you, Joshua.
And I approve.
Okay, so 8, are you abstaining, Ms. Cushman, or show of hands? Oh, okay. 8-4, 0 against. And that's all we have on our agenda. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn, Madam Chair.
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Ryder,
Second.
seconded by Mr. Hamre. We're adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.